Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for doing that. You are contributing to science. This is excellent. Today, we've got early modern English. And because early modern English is actually not as hard to understand as the other periods of English that we've covered, we won't be spending as much time on it. So today is the one class that you get on early modern English. Next time, I will tell you about late modern English, aka 1700 to the present, and then after that we get dangerously close to the actual exam, which you can start worrying about as soon as you feel ready to worry about it, or even earlier. So we'll be covering the same things as we've covered for all of the periods. We'll be talking about the printing, the external developments that shape the period. Printing, one of the major ones among them, literacy levels, which we haven't explicitly addressed so far, and the texts, of course, that are available during the period. Then we'll be going through, talking about spelling and sounds, the phonetics and phonology, the morphology and the syntax, the lexicon, the standardization and variation, and we're going to do all of that in the next 1 hour and 12 minutes. So, hold on to your seatbelts, or whatever you say. External history. Basically, the big development that's going on here is that we have the Renaissance, which is an intellectual movement to revive Greek and Latin intellectual and cultural heritage. In other words, it's Renaissance meaning rebirth, meaning the rediscovery, in essence, of a ton of old texts. Rediscovery is not always, of course, the best metaphor because they were never really completely lost. Rather, they sort of achieved a wider cultural awareness during this period. This was also a period that fostered the development of science, the development of humanism, and that goes on further with the Enlightenment period that we'll talk about next time. Of course, most of the people on the street wouldn't have cared about the Renaissance because they weren't in the business of looking at Greek and Latin texts. What they were in the business of was trying not to die. And if you try not to die in the early modern period, one useful way of doing that is to go to large cities because there are jobs in large cities. Unfortunately, then you might die of horrible illnesses, but you know, you take what you can get. So, migration to large cities during the period 1500 to 1700 and a large-scale period of poverty. In the meantime, the population is rising, especially, at least, this is generally true across Europe after some rather nasty things that happened in terms of plagues and illnesses and wars. We get a rising population level, which is one of the drivers of both of these developments. This is also the period, the early modern period is the first period when we can talk about Columbus, when we can talk about English outside the British Isles. So we start to see English being spoken, being written, being used in places other than England and Scotland and Wales. And that's quite a major development because in the Middle English period, we have very little of that, and in the Old English period, almost nothing. So we've got this expansion of English to other continents, and we don't see much of this until the 17th century, mainly because the colonies were very small and incipient in the 16th century. As we see here, Columbus reaches the what is sort of somewhat anachronistically termed the New World in 1492. New World term is useful to highlight here. It's only new to people like Columbus. There were obviously people there before, and it did not go so well for them. So one has to be careful with terms like the New World, this is basically the spread of the British Empire, the earliest stages of the spread of the British Empire under the Tudor and Stuart monarchs. And if you're interested in the Tudor and Stuart monarchs, there's all kinds of beautiful popular media depicting them. So go and watch TV shows and such like if you're interested in that. Linguistically, of course, the printing press is important. Again, the printing press may not have directly affected people on the street, the everyday person, but it nevertheless affected the way that the language was perceived, and it fostered a real shift in language ideology, as we will see, as part of the standardization process. What we also see in this period is the establishment of the Anglican Church by Henry VIII. Now, I don't know if there are any Anglicans here, and I tend to offend them by talking about the Anglican Church in this way, but the classical story about the Anglican Church is that it was founded so that Henry VIII could get out of a marriage, basically, and it has remained mostly devoid of meaningful principles ever since. And that I definitely shouldn't say, but again, hopefully no Anglicans will watch this video. If you are, then there is an email address at which you can make complaints, I believe. And the Anglican Church, of course, is a general part of the Protestant movement. So what happens here is that following the lead of people like Luther on the Consonant, Hus, and others, you get this movement which is in part intended to make religion more accessible, intended to move away from using Latin and towards using English. And that, as we'll see, has an effect on the type of texts that are available. So this is not just Henry VIII being very specific about his marital proclivities. It is more than that. Any questions? Okay, so the printing press. This is something that, as we see, is brought in to England at the very, very end of the Middle English period by Caxton. This isn't where printing came from. Printing was not invented in Britain. Nor was it really invented in Germany in any meaningful sense, so that's what people usually say. Printing was in fact invented in China circa 220, at least that's the first time printing was invented, block printing. And movable type, where you could move around the individual characters, was something that was invented in 1040, again in China. Gutenberg then invents or discovers the printing press that we know and love in the West around 1439. And the textbook goes into a fair bit of detail if you're interested in the mechanics of these things. What we are more interested in here is its effects. So before Caxton, before 1476, it's not that there weren't any books in England. There were printed books, and they were imported from countries like Italy, Germany, France, the Low Countries. By and large, not written in English, because why would they be if they were imported from these countries? And obviously, any kind of import like that would have been a luxury item, a rarity. And that carries on, actually, a tradition that was ongoing throughout the Old and Middle English periods, where books were really a special luxury item, as much a status symbol as a useful text in many ways, if you had one. And that's why, if you look at these old books, if you look at images of them, they're often very, very colourful. They've got bits of gold all over them, and they're massive. So people weren't always thinking of practicality in terms of these books. Their symbolic value, their material value, was often at least as great, if not greater, than the actual text that they contained. With the printing press, of course, that starts to change, because printing text becomes way, way easier, and distributing them becomes way, way easier as well. And between 1476 and 1640, it's been estimated that 20,000 different titles were printed in English. This is not just 20,000 books, this is 20,000 different books, each of which would have had a print run of, well, we don't know, but quite a lot. So there are easily millions of books starting to circulate during this period. And that's a huge, huge change. And it changes the way of thinking about language, about what language is and how it works, as I've said. It comes with a disadvantage as far as we're concerned. As far as the historian of the language is concerned, the problem with printed texts is that you never quite know who is to blame for any given thing that you see. If you, for instance, take a look at the textbook for this course, what you will not know, you will not immediately be able to tell whether a particular linguistic feature comes from the author of the textbook herself, Ellie van Gelderen, whether it comes from the copy editor, so someone who's gone through the text and checked it and worked closely with it, changing the language, or whether it comes even from the proofreader or the typesetter later on in the process. So there are many, many different people who are responsible for producing a book, and things used to be a lot simpler. So when books were written out by hand, you might not know much about the person who wrote it, but you can be more or less sure that one person was responsible for that text. Of course, even that is an oversimplification, because many scribes were copying out texts that had previously been written by someone else and composed by someone else entirely. But it's always important to note that when we look at printed texts, we need to be very, very careful about who we attribute the language to. A printed first folio of Shakespeare, for instance, doesn't necessarily reflect the man himself. It probably is much more complicated than that. Even the compositor, and the compositor is literally the person who gets the little pieces of movable type and moves them around in order to put things together. Even those people could change the language. So if you're interested in something like the eth ending versus the s ending, well, one thing that's important about these endings is that the s ending on verbs is a lot shorter than the eth ending. And that means that if you're a compositor trying to save space at the end of a line, you might mess around with the verb forms in order to put things in the right place. So this purely mechanical process of printing actually has linguistic effects, linguistic implications. What about literacy then? Sometimes it's said that the printing press itself was what stimulated the rise of literacy. That can only be partially true, because even during the Middle English period, we see that literacy was on the rise. So printing probably catalyzed a process that was already underway. And some overall estimates, of course, we don't know. These are not survey figures. These are rough estimates based on the best of our knowledge from Buring and Van Zanden in 2009. In the period 1451 to 1500, so this is the period in which the printing press was introduced, literacy was only at around 5%. So before the early modern period, literacy was at 5%. At the end of the early modern period, for the period, the 17th century, 1601 to 1700, literacy was at 53%. So half of the people around the country could read and write at that point. And of course, that then goes up further. You can see that this was something that people were worried about, that people were actually quite shook up about. This is a big change in society, because there were petitions. People actually started petitions to make it illegal for normal people to read, for common people to read. Right? And writing is dangerous, so this is why. The pen is mightier than the sword. Right? You can't let common people read, otherwise they'll understand too much stuff, and it'll be harder to keep them down. So people start petitions. Fortunately for us, these petitions were unsuccessful, and common people continued to be able to read. But it's important to note that these literacy figures, these overall figures, hide quite a lot of variation. And in particular, among women, literacy was lower, and it was lower for a long, long time. It was lower, in fact, until the late 19th century. So even into the Victorian era, men were much, much more likely to be able to read and write than women were. So these overall aggregate figures should be approached with some caution. As regards texts, well, I've already told you that there are over 20,000 printed texts from this period, and I'm not going to list them all, surprisingly. For a start, and part of the very interesting way in which writing developed in the early modern period was that it became not only legal but also acceptable and normal to translate Bibles during this period. And this is something, again, that's bound up with the rise of Protestantism in Britain and elsewhere as well. So Tyndale, a very famous Bible translator, he translates the Bible, but it does not end well for him. In 1536, they catch up with him. He is strangled and burned. Unfortunately for him, he was just a little bit ahead of his time, because 3 years later, in 1539, another version of the Bible came out, Coverdale's version, which was essentially based on Tyndale's, and we know that over 20,000 copies of this text were produced. So this was a widely produced, widespread English translation of the Bible, and obviously there's a huge change in the culture here about people's expectations about what you should and shouldn't be able to read. Less than 100 years later, we get the King James Bible, which is perhaps the most widely read English text ever. And this appeared in 1611. It was put together by a whole team of writers, and it has been hugely influential up until the present day. Even though there are more modern and more accurate Bible translations out there, the King James Version, especially in Britain, still has a lot of cultural power. A few years ago, the then education minister in Britain, Michael Gove, decided that he was going to make funding available so that the King James Bible could be given to every student in the country, every pupil in the country. And one might think, okay, even if you agree with the principle of giving everyone free Bibles, which, I guess, nice and good, they can at least use it as a doorstop or something. Even if you agree with the principle of giving them free Bibles, you might not agree with the principle of giving them a Bible that is 400 years old, which is actually not all that easy for anyone to read. Nevertheless, this is obviously, this is an influential text, and there's a lot to be said about it. In terms of plays, well, you all know Shakespeare. I don't really need to say all that much about him. I'll come back to him later, though. Shakespeare's born in 1564, if indeed he existed, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of literature on this. And the Shakespearean output, the Shakespearean plays, start emerging in the 1590s. So Shakespeare is slap bang in the middle of the early modern period. And at the same period, we have two other very influential playwrights, Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson. Marlowe particularly known for Dr. Faustus, for instance, and Tamburlaine, Jonson for Volpone and the Alchemist. Another exciting thing about this period is that we get texts from different genres. So we start getting the first texts that we could probably really call scientific texts. Though the word science itself was not in use during this period, these people would have considered them to be themselves to be various things, alchemists, chemists, natural philosophers, but not scientists. That term comes only actually in the 19th century. Nevertheless, science is what they were doing by modern standards, especially people like Robert Boyle, the chemist, the skeptical chemist, if we're to believe his title. We get philosophy like John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, and we even get linguistic texts like Holder's Elements of Speech. And these mostly emerge as a consequence of the Renaissance developments and the general increase in the standards of education around the country, and they emerge in the 17th century, so later in the early modern period. And here are some of the other people who were writing during this time. Lots of very interesting characters. Samuel Pepys, the diarist, to whom we owe some of our records of the most interesting things happening in London at the time. We've got fictional writers like Spencer, very famous prose writers like John Milton. We've got Queen Elizabeth I, an amazing woman in her own right. Not only was she the Queen of England, but she also wrote and translated texts herself. And many, many others. Most of the writers still during this period were men, and but nevertheless, there were a few women writing too. Not only the Queen, also very interesting characters like Aphra Behn. writing during this period. Question, yes. So the question is, different versions of the Bible, why are they different? Why do people translate things in different ways? Well, partly, I mean, there are various different aspects to this. Some of them are theological, and I can't go into them here. Different interpretations of things. Translation, of course, isn't always that easy, as you all know. Sometimes you want to translate something into English from German or into German from English, and there isn't a direct equivalent. So you've just got to think about how to get the idea across as best you can. Sometimes, and that goes even more for languages like, remember when you're translating the Bible, you're translating from New Testament Greek or Biblical Hebrew, and these languages in the modern day are simply not that well understood. Even now, people argue, theologians, biblical historians, linguists, philologists argue about the meaning of individual words and individual sentences. When aspects of the Bible are being used, for instance, to argue against same-sex marriage or against something that people do or don't do, then you can see how these actually fairly minor translational differences have huge socio-political implications. As to why there were so many translations, some of it is progress, some of it is purely translators thinking, I don't like that translation, I can do it better. And it's a difficult point, but I think as understandings of the Bible and of these other texts changed, and as the context changed, and also as the English language changed, people felt the need to update the translation to better reflect the environment that they were in, both in terms of language and in terms of culture. But some of that is speculation. It's a good question. Why exactly do we see the variation that we see? So those are some of the main authors. Are there any other questions about the texts? Okay, moving on then to the sounds and the spelling of early modern English. What's good about early modern English as far as the spelling is concerned is that it's basically the same as it is today. There are minor differences, but they really are not hugely significant things. And you can see some of them, this has gone a bit, the blue lines have gone out of skew here. But here, for instance, you can see that there are some distributional differences in this text. So, for instance, if you look here at where you would expect a U or a V, the U's and the V's don't work the same in early modern English, and in different texts they work differently. So here, for instance, we have the word silver, and this letter here is a U where we'd expect a V. Now, in some texts, the generalization is that you find V at the beginning of words and U elsewhere. And I don't know if that's true for this one, but that's a quite widespread generalization. Either way, the distribution of V and U and the difference between them wasn't fully fixed by this point. We also find lots of word final E's. So the word ransom, for instance, has an E on the end here, the world's ransom, and many words end up with E's on the end. It's hard to know what these E's mean. Some of them could be relics of old dative case endings from Middle English and that kind of thing. Some of them could just be kind of orthographical decoration. Right? It's actually quite hard to know what we're dealing with in any given case. And then there are letters that are doubled that we would expect not to be doubled, and letters that aren't doubled that we would expect to be doubled. So an example here is in the first line, royal, there's two L's at the end. So we see doubling, and the big thing that you see in these texts that it's important not to get confused by is what's called the Latin S. And the Latin S is a symbol that looks like an F. It is not an F, right? It is an S, and again, usually you find it at the beginning of words or sometimes in the middle of words. So here we have the silver sea, for instance. This is not the filver fee, even if you've got a lisp. Silver sea, set in the silver sea, precious stone set in the silver sea. So this is actually an S. It's called a Latin S, and it's very, very common in printed text from the early modern period. You almost never see it anywhere else. So you don't see it in Middle English, and you don't see it in the more recent language either. So you get words written like, here we've got such, and this is an interesting one because the word such, H's in this period also often look a lot like K's. So the word such is very easy to mistake for another word which is less polite. You also find capital letters used with nouns. So this is a little bit like what you do in German, right? If you've got a noun, you just stick it in capital letters because nouns are important, right? And I respect that about Germany. And they do it in the early modern English period as well. So we've got the world, sun, tenement, but not just nouns, other words too, actually. So capital letters are used quite frequently for important words, whatever that means, and that's something also that sets the language apart from the language that we see today. And especially in the early period, we see a lot of variability. What we see by the end of the period, particularly by the very end of the period, is that the variability dies down, and that's to do with the standardization process that I will tell you about soon. Okay, pronunciation then. Although the spelling of early modern English looks like the spelling of today, this actually hides the fact that the pronunciation was quite different, and we know that it must have been different. We know that for a number of reasons. For a start, we can look at words that rhyme with one another, and so we have, for instance, raisin rhyming with reason, and raisin and reason don't really rhyme in the modern language. If they rhyme in an early modern English text, that's usually an indication that they actually rhymed, that was how they were pronounced. So that both words, for instance, would have been pronounced with an A diphthong, perhaps, rather than the E that we hear in modern English for reason. So that rhyming evidence can give us a lot of clues as to the pronunciation. We also find, during the 17th century in particular, that people start to write about the language. They actually start to write about the language use. So in 1633, Charles Baxter publishes a list of homophones, homophones being words that sound the same but are spelt differently, such as the preposition for and the number for in modern English. And Richard Hodges, 10 years later, comes up with a list of more homophones. And the fact that these lists exist tells us that people were actually a little bit uncertain about the pronunciation of words. But these lists also tell us about the actual pronunciation. They give us more concrete information about which words rhyme with each other, which words sound the same, and sometimes even very specifically how they were pronounced, the phonetic detail. Also during this period we get many grammars emerging. So this is the period where we first really see people writing about language. We see people writing about how language is used. In the Old English and Middle English periods, there was almost none of that. People didn't, on the whole, care. They just got on with it. But in the early modern period, and it's again to do with this standardization process, we start to see people writing texts, meta-linguistic texts about language. And crucially, for these lists of homophones and things, we see that words the spelling change, the sound changes that occur during this period are not reflected in the spelling. Stress during this period also changes. This is an important point. I won't dwell on it. But you'll remember me saying that in Old English, stress is basically always on the first syllable. During the late Middle English and early modern period, that changes. In no small part due to the influx of new words from French and from Latin, where the stress was on a different syllable. And at this point, the stress becomes the unholy mess that it is today, with all kinds of words that throw off the German native speaker, such as analysis rather than analysis, and variable rather than variable. And what else do people usually get wrong? There are more. but useful to remember, especially when you approach your state exam, which for many of you will not be for a while. Now, here we are at our old friend, the Great Vowel Shift. Last time we saw the Great Vowel Shift, I was just using it to make a general point about how the language changed, about why language history is interesting, about what language history can tell us about why the language is the way it is today. Now we're going to dwell a little bit more in detail on how the Great Vowel Shift works. Basically, you can think of the Great Vowel Shift as being two movements. This that you can see behind me is a map of the vowel space. And the vowels over on this side are the front vowels, that is the vowels that are produced basically with the tongue further forward in the mouth. The ones over here are the back vowels, the ones which the body of the tongue is quite far back in the mouth. And what we see is that basically all of the vowels go up in the mouth. And of course that's not sustainable, because what happens to the ones that are at the very top? Do they all just kind of squish up together? Do all vowels just become E? They don't, because that would not be hugely useful for communication. And so perhaps this is, I don't want to say that's the cause of the change, but there could be a relation. Sounds like this one. So we start off with this word, which would have originally been pronounced beta, with an E, and that one actually goes down and becomes a centralized front diphthong, I. So E becomes I in words like beat, becoming bite. Similarly, the back one, this word would have originally been pronounced boot, and then it comes to be pronounced with this diphthong here, ow, so bout. And all of these words, you might find the pronunciations when you think about it, especially like this one here. This word here would have been in the earliest part of the early modern English period, would have been pronounced boat, which for those of you with some German may strike you as a little bit familiar. But boat does not stay boat, except in certain areas of the country. It moves upwards in the mouth and becomes this O sound, or even not quite. This is actually a sort of an understatement. Boat with a more open O rather than or. So this would be more like bought, and this would be boat, and this would be boot, and then you get bout. So basically, this is a change that affects long vowels. They all go up, except the ones that are already at the top, and those ones diphthongize. They split into a vowel which has two different heights, two different positions. So that's this I and ow. These diphthongs are single phonemes with a movement of the tongue within the phoneme. That's basically how you define a diphthong. Here are some examples of words. So before 1400, a word like name would have been pronounced Name, which again should be familiar to you, right? It went up, and it would be pronounced in 1600 as something like name, and then today it's diphthongized and it becomes name. So the Great Vowel Shift involves everything moving up and circling around, and there's a lot more to it than this chart shows. No, I don't have. I thought I had another slide, but I don't. There's a lot going on here in the Great Vowel Shift. You won't be expected to know it all, but if you have an idea of the general tendencies involved, long vowels raising, then you've got a good understanding of what's going on here. And here is a little bit more detail on the time scales and on different stages of the shift. This, like a lot of the other stuff we've discussed on the course, is still something that people are actively researching into and actively trying to find out more about. So recent work by Steenbrenden, for instance, has argued that the Great Vowel Shift, which traditionally is thought to begin in about 1400, must actually have started much earlier, in the early part of the early Middle English period, maybe as early as 11 or 1200. and that changes our understanding of the phenomenon a bit. Not all of these changes go to completion. Individual words do strange things. And like I've said, the causes of this change remain quite mysterious. We don't really know why a lot of these things happened. They just did. But we know what happened. We know that because of all of this evidence from things like spelling that I talked about earlier on. As regards the consonants, there are lots of little bits and pieces that are happening, and most of them continue the trends that we saw in Middle English. So consonant clusters become simplified. Shakespeare can make a pun on the word night, as in the guy wearing armor who slays dragons, and night, as in when the sun is down. And that shows that they must have sounded the same for Shakespeare, otherwise these puns wouldn't work. There are other ones too. Down here, we owe God a death. This actually shows that for Shakespeare, death and debt must have sounded the same. And in fact, this is a change that isn't reflected in the modern language, but this word would have been pronounced something like debt with a t, just like this one here. Incidentally, this B here is complete nonsense. This B here, we'll see more about this later on. It's not pronounced, it's just a load of rubbish, and you have the early modern people to blame for that. But we'll get to that part. So there's a fair amount of stuff going on here. The H continues to be lost. That's something we've seen before. We also see the loss of R. So this, you might know, is something that distinguishes different types of British variety. I speak a variety of, not just British, English variety in general. I speak a variety of British English, a relatively standardized variety of Middle English, in which I almost never pronounce R at the end of a word. And other people do. So for me, some of these words here, so this word, father, is pronounced exactly the same as this one, father. There's no difference for me. Americans will pronounce them differently, and also people from Scotland, for instance, and people from the southwest of England will pronounce them differently. So this is a change that only happened in certain areas of the country. It didn't make it to everywhere. And we actually see people in the 15th century writing these words in new ways. So parcel, for instance, this word here, gets written like this, parcel, which suggests that people did not pronounce the R, because if they did, they would know that they also needed to write it down, especially in the early Middle English period before spelling was standardized. Okay, I'm going to go briefly over this, but you can try this in your own time. This is also something that it will come up in the tutorial. In Shakespeare plays, you can obviously just pronounce them like modern English, but that's boring. Why would you want to do that? It's much more fun if you pronounce them with really weird vowels and consonants like they would have done in Shakespeare's time. And that's what original pronunciation is all about. And there's work on this online. You can see a couple of, there's a video here, and you can see David Crystal, who's a famous linguist with a big bushy white beard, and his son, Ben Crystal, who's an actor. They've teamed up and they do this original pronunciation of Shakespeare thing. So here are some of the equivalences that you would have seen. Most of this is due to the great vowel shift. So you'd see words like meat, for instance, which today is pronounced with an E diphthong. In original pronunciation, this word would have been pronounced mate. This word here is pronounced what in modern English, at least in my variety. In original pronunciation, it's pronounced hua. In fact, this is actually not a very good transcription, but hua. And this is something that you still see in certain dialects. So in Irish English, for instance, words like the following would be distinguished in pronunciation. So Wales, the country, in Irish English is pronounced Wales. In in Irish English, the animal plural is pronounced whales. And this would be very useful in the current political circumstance, so that people like Donald Trump would not claim to have met the Prince of Wales. Right? This actually happened, believe it or not. I mean, not the whales, but you get the idea. Okay, so here's an example of some original pronunciation. I'm not going to do the whole thing, just a little bit to give you an idea. So this is the famous balcony speech, and it starts off, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks. It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fire sun, and kill the envious moan. So there we go. Everything sounds quite different. When I do this, it reminds me of Yorkshire accent, actually. And I think that's not an accident, because the Yorkshire variety of English, Yorkshire British English, actually preserves a lot of the features that were present in early modern English. It's a quite archaic dialect in terms of its pronunciation. Okay, any questions about the pronunciation? Like I say, go and watch the video. You might be surprised at how little you actually understand. It's hard enough to read Shakespeare. Listening to this stuff is even trickier, but it's helpful because it helps you get a sense for how this language really sounded, and the written texts are misleading, so that's why I think it's a useful exercise. Okay, morphology and syntax then. What's going on in the early modern English period? Pronouns, first of all. Pronouns develop by the end of the early modern English period to look more or less the same as they do today. The second person pronouns are a bit more interesting in terms of their story. I've addressed some of this development already. In late Middle English and also even at the time of Shakespeare, we have a distinction between a familiar pronoun, thou and thee, or as they would have been pronounced then, thou and they, and a polite form, ye and yo, you. And so we see this, like I've said before, in Chaucer's texts, you can see this very clearly, the distinction between familiar and polite. It stays as far as Shakespeare, and in the early modern English period, by the end of this period, all of these forms have basically been wiped out, and you is the only form that remains. Which on the one hand makes the language very easy to learn, at least as far as second-person plurals are concerned. On the other hand, it means that some meaning distinctions are lost. In my variety of English, for instance, I can't distinguish between the singular and plural. So if I say you don't know if I'm talking to everyone in the room or just Jens. So this is something that's quite bad, and that's why many varieties have actually developed a non-standard form like y'all or yous or you guys or yin or yiz to replace this plural, because functionally it's something that's quite useful to have. Now, when thou disappears, the pronoun thou disappears, and that happens in pretty much every variety. Again, if you go to places in rural Yorkshire, you will still find people using thou, but not very many of them. When thou disappears, the form of the verb that goes with it, this st form, is also lost, naturally. So the second person singular st ending bites the dust, and the third person ending also changes. The third person ending changes from a th to a s. We already saw the start of this change in the Middle English period. In the early modern period, it goes further. Different authors use this differently. Shakespeare has a particular way of using these forms. Shakespeare uses hath and doth specifically, but generally with other verbs, he uses s. So these eth forms for Shakespeare are kind of relic forms for high-frequency verbs. The productive verbal ending for Shakespeare is an s in the third person singular. And after Shakespeare, in 1600, we find even hath and doth disappearing. except in the King James Bible, because the King James Bible is very conservative, which is why we get sentences like this. The hay appeareth, and the tender grass showeth itself, rather than an S, which is what we'd expect today. And at the same time, the subjunctive dies out, and the subjunctive is essentially replaced by modal auxiliaries. This ties in with a broader trend in the history of the language, where in general, auxiliaries increase. In Old English, you see relatively few auxiliaries, though you do see some. But in early modern English, we start to see quite a lot of them. We start to see modals in new places, we see do in new places, as we talked about before, and so on and so forth. And progressives, we see more progressives. So the further we go on in the history of English, it seems like the more we see new auxiliaries being used, and you just cram more and more verbs into one sentence. And they're used to express tense, mood, and aspect. So, for instance, in the early modern period, we see finite forms where we would expect to see, today we would expect to see a form of be plus an ing. So, whither go you, in Shakespeare's language, whither go you, would be where are you going in the modern language. And similarly, I saw him not gets replaced by I have not seen. You get a perfect periphrasis. This is a change that happens in many of the languages of Europe, incidentally. German underwent the same development. We also see be being used for the perfect sometimes. So normally to form a perfect, in modern English, we always use have. I have come, I have died, so on and so forth. With certain verbs, in the early modern period, we use be. So for instance, come would be I am come. And this, again, parallels something that you see in other European languages, such as French and German. In French, you've got a distinction between avoir and être, according to how you form your perfect. In German, you've got haben and sein. Ich bin gekommen, and not ich habe gekommen. And this used to exist in the early modern period, but now it's gone. Do, this is something I mentioned. In present-day English, do is obligatory in certain contexts. You always find do in negatives, and you always find do in questions. And Shakespeare already uses it variably. So you find do in a question. Here's the Tempest. Do you not hear him? So an earlier form would be hear you not him, without this do. We also see a heavy heart bears not a humble tongue. So this is a more archaic form. The modern equivalent would be a heavy heart does not bear a humble tongue, with a do. And this do is something we see the first traces of it around 1400, and by 1700, so by the end of the early modern period, it is everywhere, this do form. What's interesting about do is that you can actually use it to figure certain things out. An author who uses more do or less do in the early modern period, this is something that you can use for interesting purposes. For instance, authorship attribution. There's a whole huge literature on who wrote Shakespeare's plays and which of them Shakespeare actually wrote, if indeed he wrote any of them at all. And one of the things you can do is look at the frequency of do, of the verb do. And what you find is, for instance, if you look at the play Henry VIII by Shakespeare, the traditional view is that some parts of this are written by Shakespeare and some of them are written by another writer, John Fletcher. And in the parts that are written by Shakespeare, you find a lot of do, and in the parts that are written by Fletcher, you don't find as much. So these low-level linguistic features that you probably would never think about can be really useful as a kind of forensic clue to discover who wrote a given text. This is something, incidentally, forensic linguistics is a very active field today. People use it, for instance, if someone has written an anonymous death threat in a letter, you can give it to a forensic linguist and they can compare it with other authors and say, yeah, the language here looks a lot like, I don't know, her former boyfriend. Usually it's just that, right? But you can use the language as evidence to actually prove or disprove a particular authorship attribution. So there's a whole field there. I can't go into it, but if you're interested in that kind of thing, just look up authorship attribution or forensic linguistics, and you'll find all kinds of interesting things online. So, preposition stranding. This is an interesting one because it's something that technically, you're not supposed to do, even though everyone does it. And in fact, what's funny about it is that everyone has done it ever since Old English. So if this is a mistake, it's not even a new one. It's something that we've been doing for 1,200 years at least. And this would be a sentence like, the man that I spoke to, or the man I spoke to, in a relative clause. Now, in relative clauses, it's found ever since Old English. In Middle English, we find more preposition stranding. It expands to new environments that it wasn't possible in before, like questions, passives, and topicalizations. So these are examples like the ones here. The man was spoken to is a passive. That man I would never speak to, topicalization. And who did you speak to is a question, a WH question. Again, formally speaking, you should use what's called the pied piping variant, which is the variant which has to in front of the WH words, like, to whom did you speak? But basically, in speech, almost no one does this in the 21st century. This is something that Shakespeare uses. Again, can't be that bad if a writer like Shakespeare uses it. The cottage and the bounds that the old Carlot once was master of. Relative clause stranding. Not a problem. That's from As You Like It. What changed was that in the 17th century, John Dryden decided that preposition stranding was bad and decided that he wasn't going to use it anymore and that neither should anyone else. Why? Who knows? It's one of these mysterious things. Probably because you can't do it in Latin. And Latin is something people think, well, Latin is, in this period, Latin is revered. This is part of the Renaissance. Latin is the perfect language, right? It's the language of learning, the language of knowledge and beauty. So every language should be like Latin. And if a language does something like preposition stranding, that's weird, and it should be ruled out. Obviously, that's nonsense, because not every language is Latin, right? Languages are different. But nevertheless, this kind of ideology had a lot of influence during the period. Any questions about the syntax and the morphology? So we're seeing what we saw in every other lecture so far as well, which is as time goes on, we find more of a development towards an analytic language and away from a synthetic language, in broad overview terms. The increase in use of auxiliaries, in particular, and the loss of endings like st is the crucial evidence for a change like this. What about the lexicon then? What's going on here? Well, as I've already hinted at, we get a ton of new loanwords after the beginning of the Renaissance, because people are suddenly starting to read lots of Latin. Also, there's very, very active trade and political relations with the Consonant, so we get lots and lots of other things happening to do with French words. The French connection continues. We find loans like anachronism, disability, expectation, folio, sometimes romance-based, sometimes like anachronism, actually ultimately Greek-based, Greek-derived, sometimes via Latin from Greek. And we get new words being developed that actually are based on Latin or Greek or French parts, but which were never used in those ways in those languages. And these words here, episcopal, blatant, disaccustom, urban, and urge, are examples of this kind. Now, during this period, during this early modern period, most of the new words that we find come from Latin. But there are also some from French and some from Greek, as I've said, and not only. We also see loanwords from Italian, from Spanish, from Low German, from Dutch, and many other languages. This is the start, really, we've seen this get kicked off in the Middle English period. English is borrowing from Anglo-Norman, it's borrowing from Norse. During the early modern period, this gets supercharged, and you get loads and loads of Latin borrowings, loads and loads of French borrowings, and then all kinds of other borrowings from all over the place. I recently heard this described as English doesn't really borrow words from other languages. It kind of waits until that language is in a dark alley at night and then sneaks up behind them and takes their words from them by force. So English is doing a lot of this loanword thing during this period. What's interesting is that the Latin loanwords are particularly in formal kind of contexts, in specific registers. So the scientific texts that I told you about that are emerging during this time, the philosophical texts, also the religious texts, history texts, grammars, that kind of thing, they're using a lot of this Latinate vocabulary, this classical vocabulary. And the core of the language, the basic vocabulary, is much less affected. We saw some borrowings of basic words from Norse, for instance, but we don't see it happening very much at all with Latin during this period. When you look, for instance, these are mostly nouns and verbs, right? So open class words that there can be any number of. Prepositions, on the other hand, there are a few. So per, plus, and via are all prepositions that are borrowed from English, from Latin, sorry. But all of these prepositions are actually quite rarely used. And I'm not sure that all of them actually are prepositions. Plus, for instance, you can't strand it. Right? You can't say, you can say, I plus John are going to the shops or something, but you can't say something like, who did you go plus? It's really bad. So these Latin function words are not all that productive. So the big classical influence is in nouns and in verbs, and the more high register you go, the more of it you see. And the more words you take into account, also, the higher percentage of them are from Latin and Greek, because these are often very rare words. During this period, there was actually a controversy. People were not happy about the fact that all of these words were being borrowed. And this relates to the fact, if you'll remember what we talked about last time with Middle English, people in the Middle English period they felt like they had to justify their use of English. Right? They felt like they had to fight for it. They said, yeah, English is a good language. We can do just as much with English as other languages. But in the early modern English period, the pendulum has swung so far that people are really proud of English. They think English is great. You can do lots of things with English. And as a result, so for instance, here we see Mulcaster, who's a writer about English itself. He says, I take this present period of our English tongue to be the very height thereof, because I find it so excellently well found, both for the body of the tongue itself and for the customary writing thereof, as either foreign workmanship can give it gloss, or as home-wrought handling can give it grace. So Mulcaster really loves his own language. And this comes with another view. So here we see John Cheek at the beginning of the early modern period saying, I am of the opinion that our own tongue should be written clean and pure, unmixed and unmangled with borrowing of other tongues, wherein, if we take not heed by time, ever borrowing and never paying, she shall be fain to keep her house as bankrupt. So Cheek was quite keen to keep the language free of borrowings, which is kind of nonsense at this point, because there have already been so many borrowings, and we can see that Cheek is using several of them himself. Right? So bankrupt, for instance, this is a learned borrowing from French Latin, among other things. So we see many of these borrowings, even though people like Cheek were trying to argue against them. And you can see parallels today when you listen, for instance, to the sort of things that the Verein Deutsche Sprache are trying to do. Right? They're often not happy with borrowings. They really would prefer it if we just used nice German words like Rechner instead of computer, for instance. And Chi was actually quite creative because he tried to create new words so that you didn't need to use borrowings. So the word prophet, for instance, this comes from Greek originally. He said, no, don't say prophet, you should use the word foresayer, because that's a nice, clean English word. And lunatic, again, learned borrowing. We shouldn't use this, we should use the word mooned. Right? Rather than saying someone is a lunatic, we should say that they are mooned. But not everyone who's creating new words is doing so because they want to keep their vocabulary pure. Some of them are just doing it because creating new words is fun and because it allows you to do cool things. So Spencer, for instance, creates a lot of new words. Shakespeare is well known for his creation of new words. He's probably... If you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, for instance, I think more words are first attested in Shakespeare than in any other author. That could be a sampling thing, but it's also very clear that Shakespeare was linguistically very creative. Or the Shakespearean texts are very linguistically creative anyway. And many of these here are words that you find for the first time in Shakespeare. Some of them we don't really see very often, like these hybrids, to fore-advise or to out-villain someone. Out-villain is a good word, actually, and I think it should be brought back in the context of the present-day Conservative leadership contest between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt, where they're both basically trying to out-villain each other. And Jeremy Hunt is like, well, I managed to screw over the junior doctors, and Boris Johnson is like, yeah, but I got into a fight with my girlfriend and took drugs. So basically they're just trying as hard as they can to be as terrible a person as they can. And whoever becomes more terrible will be the person who wins the vote. To any Conservative watchers of this video, I do not apologize. All right, finally, standardization and variation. This is something I've been hinting at the whole time because this is really the elephant in the room. This is really the big happening during the early modern English period. We see standardization and we see the amount of variation in printed texts going down. So what does this entail? Well, before the 17th century, we see a lot of variability in vocabulary and spelling. You've already seen when you look at Middle English that one of the things that makes Middle English hard is that the texts are very diverse. If you know how to read one Middle English text, like a Chaucer text, it won't necessarily help you all that much to read something like Gawain or the Ormulum or the Peterborough Chronicle. And this variability contracts. Basically because of development of this standard. And people in this period start to develop proposals to make the spelling of the language more uniform, to make it fit better with its pronunciation, among other things. So we see a few works here, Hart's orthography, Bullock's book at large, and these proposals come with new letters, and here are some of them. If John Hart had had his way, if he'd been successful, then we would see these letters being used in the modern language. So for the sound ch, for instance, we would have this beautiful curly thing. And for the sound zh, we would have this thing, which looks a bit like a unicycle. And I think the language, in many ways, would be better off if Hart had got his way, because Hart was proposing a more or less one-to-one correspondence between spelling, between grapheme and phoneme. And that actually would be quite a nice thing to have, especially for learners of the language. Now, of course, it'll probably never happen. But you never know. Never say never. The process of standardization can be broken down into 4 steps. If you want a language to become standardized, and what does it mean for a language to be standardized? It means there is one norm. There is one norm that you can go to as your reference point. So what do you need for standardization? First, you need to pick which out of the many variants of your language is going to become the standard. So again, you can look at the history of German. You could see, in principle, there would have been many candidates for this. It could have been that the standard developed out of Bayerisch. It could have been that it developed out of Schwäbisch. It could have been that it developed out of some sort of Plattdeutsch. There's no linguistic reason that it didn't. The reason that the standard is largely based on some sort of combination of Luther's language and the language of Central Germany with a few Upper German influences is essentially these reasons are social and political and cultural in nature, not linguistic. And in English, basically this decision was made by the fact that London was becoming the central power of the country. We had this big city developing, that was where the chancery was, that was where the printing press was, that was where most of the people were, and all of this leads to the London variety essentially becoming the de facto standard of English. So that's selection. We also have the process of codification. Codification is important, and this relates to what I said earlier. You get grammars during this period, you get lists of homophones during this period, you get proposals about the phonetics of the language during this period. People are proud of their language and they're starting to write about it. And they're starting to write not just how it is used, but also how it ought to be used. They're starting to be prescriptive about language during this period. The real flourishing of the prescriptive norm, the use of prescriptivism, was something that happened during this period, particularly the late part of the early modern English period and the early part of the late modern English period. So between the 16th and the 18th centuries, especially the 18th century, and we'll come back to this next week, writers like Bishop Lowth, Lindley Murray, and Dr. Johnson himself. And basically, this is something that you need if you want to tell other people how to use the language, right? If I want to say, you need to speak better English, I can go down to the Osiander and pick up a book that says, here's how to speak English, right? If you want to tell other people how to speak Swabian, it's not so easy, right? You can't go to like the Duden for Schwäbisch or something, right? Or is there such a thing? I don't know, by now, right? But it took them a while to get there, I think. So, codification is important. You need books, and you need books that tell you how to use the language. We have elaboration. So, elaboration is the process by which the language gets used for a wider range of functions. That's something that we've already talked about in the context of new scientific texts, plays, political texts, philosophical texts, and in the early modern period you start to get the full works. So from the 15th to the 17th centuries, this elaboration takes place. And the English language is never all that worried about not having enough words, because whenever English wants new words, it just takes them from other languages, as we've seen. Latin words, Greek words, French words, doesn't matter where we get them from, form new words, whatever. We're not picky about the words. We just like to get all the words and bring them and put them into one big bag. So that's the process of elaboration. And then finally, the final process is that you have to get people to actually accept this variety and to use this variety. And of course, to some extent, this is still ongoing. And there is still variation in present-day English. And probably there always will be. So for instance, if you compare American English to British English, there are pronunciation differences, there are spelling differences, there are even syntactic differences to some extent. So really, this acceptance process is the last one to be completed, and it may be, in some sense, will never be completed, because you will never get everyone using a pure standard form. But it's important I think it's useful to think about standardization as consisting of these four components: selection, codification, elaboration, and acceptance. And there's usually a question about this on the exam. So if the inherent interest of this wasn't enough, there's an extra incentive to learn about it. So during the early modern English period, we start to get word lists. We have several. These are basically mini dictionaries. We don't get serious dictionaries during this period. That comes later, and we'll talk about it next time. At first, these are just lists of difficult words, lists of words that people will find hard to pronounce. One interesting question here is, other countries, France developed an academy, the Académie Française, Italy developed an academy, Spain developed an academy, Germany even to some extent never quite got a full-on academy but had language societies during the relevant period to police its usage. And this was all of this standardization happened in all of these countries at approximately the same time. Standardization is pretty inherently tied up with the rise of modern proto-nation states. So it's to do with countries becoming political entities. And it's an interesting question to ask why English never had an academy in the way that these other languages did. Not one, I think, that I can dwell on now for time reasons. There is some evidence for dialects, for varieties in the early modern period, but for the most part, we don't see it. What we do see is that, like Chaucer, Shakespeare is very conscious of dialect variation, and so in his plays, he uses features of rural English for his rural characters. So, for instance, in King Lear, the character Edgar disguises himself as a peasant, and when he's disguised as a peasant, he uses southern pronunciation. Specifically, you remember what this is called? Voicing of initial fricatives. So, zer instead of sir, further instead of further. This very southern, rural feature of English we get used for a kind of semi-comic effect, right? But not only comic, it's also showing that this guy is disguising himself. He's taking on a different persona. There is much more to be said about the varieties, which we cannot say now. Here is a summary of what I have covered in today's lecture. Now all we have left to talk about is what to do for the tutorial. And the task this time is to take a look at text 6 by Shakespeare on Ilias, watch this video, and then think about pronouncing this text. Have a go at pronouncing this text for yourself. Right. Find a quiet place where no one will hear you, and see if you can pronounce what's going on here. Next time, we will be talking about modern English. That's it for today.